Okay, well, good afternoon again, folks, and again, welcome to today's Mailers Hub webinar. Today, our topic is paper industry trends. I think paper is something important to all of our systems, and today we're going to be talking about the supply and the lack thereof. And our guest presenter today is Mark Pitt, Executive Director of the American Forest and Paper Association. Mark is the Executive Director for the printing and writing papers, pulp, and tissue sectors of the AF&PA. He's responsible for developing and coordinating policy and market advocacy that drive informed decisions on issues including sustainability, competitiveness, environmental reputation, product standards, development, and statistics for AF&PA members. He also leads the Postal Affairs issues at AF&PA. Mark represents the association at the Mailers Technical Advisory Committee, MTAC, and previously served as chair of the Consumers for Paper Options Coalition. He currently sits on the board of Two Sides North America and is active in the Coalition for a 21st Century Postal Service and in meetings with senior postal leadership and other association groups. Prior to joining AF&PA, Mark was an executive with Gladfelter Paper Company, serving in sales, marketing, and new product development roles. So we're very happy to have Mark with us today. And without further delay, please, Mark, take it away.
Thanks, Leo. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you folks to try to explain a little about what you may be feeling. And I know you're feeling some pain, so I kind of understand the topic title of Paper Pains. I'm not so sure I would characterize the current situation as a crisis as much as maybe transformation, and you're probably feeling the effects of transformation right now. So I'll try to explain that a little bit. I'm going to go from kind of a broad perspective first, and then funnel down to more specific things that I thought might be of particular interest to you. And we'll try to make this pretty casual, and feel free along the way, if anybody has questions, feel free to ask, and don't feel like you have to wait till the end. So if everybody's good with that, we'll get started. So I want to start out by showing you a little bit about the U.S. industry. We call it paperboard. And I'll go into those distinctions a little bit later, but this is a snapshot of the industry as a whole. And you can see in the bar charts that over time, the paper industry has been relatively stable, with production, imports, and exports all operating within a pretty narrow range, with the exception of the recession that took place in 2008, 2009, when there was a significant drop in both supply and demand. But I do want to reinforce that, despite the perception that paper may be going away, the forest products industry accounts for approximately 4% of total U.S. Manufacturing GDP. We manufacture over $300 billion in products annually, and we employ approximately 950,000 people. And we're also among the top 10 manufacturing sector employees in 45 states. So while there's certainly been some changes over time, and there's less paper used today than in the past, we're still here and we're not going away. And this slide just shows you how things have been relatively stable over time. So the next, please. And again, from an overall perspective, this slide is showing how paper is being consumed in the U.S. Starting in 2005, paper consumption reached its height in 2006, with about 100 million tons of paper and paperboard being consumed in the U.S. And we started a pretty serious decline, from that point of time. For printing papers, it was due to electronic substitution and just the way people changed the way they do business. But then in 2008, 2009, the big issue there was the recession. Paper utilization typically follows economic trends. So when the economy falls off, paper use also falls off. And total consumption has declined 28% since that peak of 2006. But following the recession, that rate of decline has averaged less than 1% a year. So again, over the long period of time, it's been a pretty stable picture, but I think what you're feeling right now is illustrative of a short-term change, and we'll get into that in a few minutes.
Hey, Mark, is that decline parallel in any way to the decline in mail volume, or is that just a coincidence?
I think it's related, Leo. I mean, the printing and writing sector is is in secular decline. As people change the way they communicate, as they change how they do business, a lot of this has been switched to electronic alternatives. So, and that's where mail is. So it's basically, the same thing that mailers have experienced. And we talked to the Postal Service saying that, we're going through the same exact things that you are, and we've got experience in this. So that's why we can sort of talk to them about, or provide some perspective about, what works and what doesn't. And this just shows you, talks about how capacity within the industry has changed over time. And here again, you can see in the last several years, 2018 through 2020, it has averaged about 1.1% decline. And over the last 10 years, it's the same 1.1% decline. So it's just one more situation that illustrates that in terms of the supply base for paper and paperboard over time, it has been pretty stable, hasn't changed to any great degree. Next slide, please. However, once you start going past the very top line and look at the individual segments of the paper and paperboard industry, you can see where there are some big changes that have taken place within the segments, and all those moving parts have different experiences. So container board, that's what we call container board. You call it probably cardboard. It has grown over the last 10 years. It's always been the largest sector, but that percentage is even higher now. The printing paper sector has declined quite a bit over those last 10 years. Paperboard, and these are products like cereal boxes, shoe boxes, those kinds of products. They've been pretty stable. Tissue products like bath tissue, napkins, paper towels have grown somewhat. Other specialty packaging, pretty stable. And then over on the right-hand side, you can see here that newsprint has changed dramatically in the last 10 years. So a lot of individual ups and downs that contribute to an overall fairly smooth curve that you saw before.
So, Mark, on your chart there, when the paper container board is growing and printing and writing paper is dropping, I guess it's chicken and the egg, but how much is demand change and how much is because mills find their own economic reasons for doing that?
Well, it's primarily driven by demand. And we'll see a little later that, if you don't have a reasonable supply-demand balance, then you've got some pretty major dislocations in the marketplace. If demand is a lot below supply, then you're going to see companies going out of business. And if demand is higher than supply, you're going to find some very tight conditions. So it's really a demand-driven phenomenon, but also it's not just domestic demand. Our industry is a global industry for sure. So in addition to domestic demand, we are contending with global demand pressures. We are contending with import pressures. We're contending with exchange rates. So all those things sort of factor in. And, I can't say there's one, defining factor, but demand is probably the largest one. And we've seen in the container board area, the biggest change has been that products that used to be packed in great big container board boxes that go to big box stores are now being packed in individual boxes going to your doorstep. So that's a lot more, from a volume standpoint, that's a lot more cardboard being shipped and produced than it was in the past. What we call the Amazon effect. So now I'm going to shift from sort of a big broad overview to talking about specifics within the printing paper sector of the business, which is, I think, where you folks live and are interested in. So we'll talk about printing papers. And this slide just kind of gives you an idea of how we break down the printing paper segment by grade type. There are 4 primary grade types that we deal with, the largest of which is uncoated free sheet. That is uncoated, primarily copy paper, a lot of the paper that's used for envelopes, a lot of paper that gets used for statements. That's all considered in that uncoated free sheet grade category. Coated free sheet is high-level magazine catalogs, advertising, marketing kinds of mail, that sort of thing. Uncoated mechanical, those are things like newspaper inserts, kind of lower quality uncoated paper. And coated mechanical is kind of spans coated free sheet and uncoated mechanical, and that's used in a lot of lower level magazines and catalogs. So in 2010, that consumption was almost 24, that should be millions of tons, sorry. We always talk in terms of millions, and I didn't identify that here on the slide, but 24 million tons. In 2020, that had shrunk to 11 million tons. And uncoated free sheet has grown as a percentage of that from 42% to 51%. So anybody have any questions about that? Hopefully that's pretty clear to folks.
Yeah, I don't see any just yet.
Okay, we'll go on to the next slide. So this just gives you a sense for the consumption of just printing and writing paper. We saw that as the industry as a whole before, but this is just printing and writing paper. And you can see here that the recession had a dramatic effect on the consumption of printing paper, dropping that considerably in that 2008, 2009 to a new lower level plateau that had kind of a steady stream of demand decline through 2008, 2009, between about 4 and 6% a year. And then when COVID hit in 2020, that was another precipitous drop. So over that 10-year period, the consumption of printing papers has declined about half. So that is significant. And this slide takes that change and looks at it from a year-over-year perspective. And you can see that in 2020, in 2019, those consumption changes were at the highest rate ever seen in our lifetime. Again, typically you'll see consumption change, a few percent You know, the recession in 2008, 2009 was an anomaly, and that consumption drop in 2020, 2019 was even deeper than that. So paper manufacturers that make printing papers were in a situation in 2020 that they had never seen before. Consumption had dropped to a new low without really any understanding about where it was going to go. It was totally uncertain in 2020 as the pandemic sort of wreaked havoc across all businesses about what the future was going to bring or where demand was going to land. No one knew, and it was a very unsettling situation.
Mark, I know we're only in September here, but are your members reporting a rebound from that drop, so that 2021 is going to look a little bit better than 2020 did?
Yes, and we'll drill down to more near term and talk about that. So here's some information I thought you might find interesting. As I mentioned, newsprint was probably, well, there's no question, newsprint has been hurt more than any other sector in the entire paper industry. The demand for newsprint has dropped off 70% in the last 10 years. So that has gone to digital. I'm sure that that's not a surprise to you folks, but folks who don't see our statistics too often get really sort of shocked by how dramatically that's dropped off. But that is, you know, it has not settled out. We don't know where the next normal is for newsprint. Next slide. For uncoated freesheet, consumption has followed a similar pattern. And again, that decline over the last 10 years has been about 43%, but with a very precipitous drop in 2020. And the next slide. For coated papers, again, you know, this is all similar stories where you get, you know, a huge drop with the recession. It kind of sorts itself out to a new level with sort of a steady, consistent decline, and then a steep drop in 2020. And over those past 10 years, coated paper consumption has dropped by 56%. And you've probably seen that in your mailbox. You've probably gotten fewer magazines and catalogs over the last year or so, year and a half, than you did in the past. And a lot of those publications were sold in newsstands, which have not been frequented very much in the last year and a half because of the pandemic. And this is a snapshot over time showing shipments, which is really a proxy for demand, and operating rates. The industry financial analysts that look at our industry use operating rates as a key metric that they use to sort of determine sort of the strength or the health of the industry. And you can see here on this red line that, you know, it took a dip at the recession, came back up following that, and was pretty consistent over time. From 2010 to 2019, the operating rate was averaging about 90% of capacity. And it took a big drop starting in 2019 and 2020. So at the end of 2020, the operating rate had dropped to an all-time low of 75%. Again, this was another situation where the industry has never seen a drop of operating rates to that low percentage. Those of us who've been around for a really long time have an old saying that the distinction between feast and famine is 5%. So if you're running around 90% you are operating at a pretty comfortable rate. If you're at 85%, you're starting to get pretty concerned about not being able to return your cost of capital.
Mark, just to clarify a question in my own mind, the shipments that you show there, demand, that is in the U.S. and the operating rate is U.S. mills?
That's correct. So this is U.S. production and operating rates with those mills that are in production.
So is it possible to infer that some of the gap is because people are buying offshore?
It has been the case kind of up and down over time. But yes, typically, if there's a demand drop or if there's exchange rate issues or if overseas demand is a lot worse for those manufacturers there and they're looking for other global places to sell their products, then that all enters into our shipments being down, depending on how those dynamics work. But if you're operating, in the 85% range, you're in trouble. And this slide shows you that, over a very long time frame, the paper manufacturers have been adjusting their capacity to respond to that drop in demand so that they can operate at a level that allows them to return their cost of capital and hopefully be profitable. So again, it's a pretty dramatic story about capacity that's been taken out of the system over time.
And is it safe to say, Mark, that the capacity they're no longer devoting to writing paper or printing paper has been shifted over to containerboard?
Some of that has been happening, and some of it is just decommissioning paper machines or mills that will never see the light of day again. And part of what's happened too is that companies that have multiple mills are looking to optimize those mills, shifting capacity to those mills that are the most efficient. Efficiency improvements have been part of what we've been doing, from day one. So you may have multiple mills where one mill maybe just can't compete because of its cost of energy or its location or transportation or other things that relate to that operation. So they may shut that particular mill down and move that capacity over to another mill that's more efficient. And this is a slide that, again, sort of shows you in recent years how printing paper folks have been changing their capacity, and those changes have been significant. In 2018 through 2020, it was just over 9% on the average, where that, as I mentioned before, demand decline over the previous 10 years was around 4 to 6%. They've taken about 6% of capacity out of line over those 10 years. But in 2021, that capacity shift accelerated to almost 15%. So you've seen a really huge drop in capacity in this last year to 2 year period. And this slide sort of identifies and goes back to your point, Leo, about how those capacity changes manifest themselves. So it could be a machine conversion to make other products that are more in demand. It could be a permanent machine shutdown or an entire mill shutdown, or it could be a temporary shutdown, which we call a machine idle, where you may take a machine down for a period of time with the expectation that when demand comes back, you will reopen that machine. And then the table below that just identifies how some of those changes have occurred over the last 2 years and how those changes manifested themselves. Either it was a conversion to other products, which has been the largest shift, printing paper to packaging papers, but a fair amount being a permanent shut and some being idle. But that just gives you an idea of, the kinds of volumes that you're talking about. And this slide now brings you a little closer to home in terms of just looking at the last, year and a half or so. So you saw in 2020, starting in February and March, the pandemic really took hold, and that's when businesses shut down. You can see where that shipment trend just dropped like a rock, and it started to sort of stabilize through the end of the year. And in February of 2021, it started to expand. And in April and May, that's when the trend started moving up. Those stats that we have right now are in July. Our August stats were just released this week. So before I did this deck, and those shipments have moved up since there, but you're seeing it in all 3 categories. So there you're seeing the shipment trend moving up, but not really starting until, the February and March timeframe. So we went through almost an entire year with the situation being pretty uncertain in terms of paper manufacturers, and they were very loath to just run the equipment and make inventory in case it came back, because there was no real clear signal when or if demand was going to come back. But you can see here that it did start to come back. The next slide, please. And then this just shows you how those shipments and the operating rates have moved over that period of time. Again, when we got into that 60% operating rate, that was really crisis time. So if there was a crisis, that's when it was, back last May. And you can see here the shipments have come back. Operating rates have gone back into the reasonableness zone. So we're kind of getting back in terms of operating rates back to historical norms where things are reasonably in balance.
Mark, referring back to your slide that had conversions and shuttered plants and idled machines and things, how much of that is one way? Can the mill simply be reopened, or can a machine be converted back to producing what's used for mail, or how much of what's lost is lost forever?
Well, I would say that if a mill or a machine is being converted from what we call white printing paper to packaging papers, it's usually a permanent switchover. The ability to go back and forth. Typically, that flexibility typically is not there. Each machine has some range of product they can make, but it's usually within the same product line. Now, that's not universally true. There are some machines that have enough flexibility in them where they can kind of go back and forth, but I would say that's more the exception than the rule. So I'm kind of winding up here to bring you to where you probably are right now, which is like, okay, well, what's going on right now, and why am I feeling what I'm feeling? So what I've discussed earlier today is basically a capacity phenomenon, where that reduction in capacity has joined with limited shipping availability and low levels of inventory that have resulted in very long lead times where, a year and a half ago, you could call up your paper supplier and get paper within days or a week or so. And now you call up and it's, 6 to 8 to 10 to 12 weeks. So it is essentially a capacity situation where capacity has not leveled out with demand. And my intuition tells me that there is some forward buying going on as well. A number of buyers start to see a signal saying, hey, if my prices for paper is going up and my lead times are going out, I better buy some more just so that I don't get stuck somewhere. And that becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So that is kind of a non-essential demand or pre-buying, which can exasperate the problem.
So this is a commercial printing equivalent to what we did in the pandemic of going out to Costco or whatever and buying 20 rolls of toilet paper.
Yes, exactly. So, and what you're seeing in terms of pricing, this is not just paper companies being greedy, but this is paper companies trying to recover some of the increases that they have felt in raw material costs, inputs, in transportation costs. This whole pandemic has created a supply chain situation where, materials and getting them, the cost of getting them has all gone up. The recovered fiber market has changed a lot. Back in 2017, 2018, when the China policy started and they stopped taking recycled paper, mixed paper value was zero, or you had to pay to have it taken away. And now it's, $75. So, those prices have changed dramatically. The other factor that you're feeling today that maybe wasn't such an issue in years past is because of ocean freight availability and the increasing cost of maritime shipping, that has had a very dampening effect on imports. So in years past, if there was a gap between demand and domestic supply, the imports typically sort of came in to try to fill that gap, and that has been less of an event this time through because of availability and the cost of containers going to this country. But there is some light. There is new capacity being added on early in 2022, 185,000 tons per year, which should help take some of the pressure off. That doesn't happen immediately. Once you make the decision to restart a machine that has been shut down, that means you have to line up labor, you have to line up materials, supply chain, all those sorts of things, and that takes time. But this is kind of, in a nutshell, what we know you're feeling. So that's pretty much what I had planned for today.
Well, I think that gives us a good overview of what's going on. I think that the question remains for the companies in the commercial mail production arena. Can they expect to see these tight times remain for 2 months, 6 months, a year? What's their reasonable expectation?
Well, if I knew that, Leo, I'd be in a different job. I can tell you, make a lot more.
we'd be on the lottery, right?
But I think when we look over time at these sort of peak and trough periods, those periods have become shorter and shorter over time. So, I think we're probably in, what people would call tight conditions for printing paper for a few more months. That changes depending on, who's making what. I know that, in these periods where demand sort of exceeds supply, paper manufacturers are doing things like trying to reduce the number of SKUs that they make and trying to have larger, longer runs on the basic materials that they make that are in their sweet spot so that they can maximize their, production per hour. So it's also a very dynamic, orders in manufacturing is very dynamic, and people, particularly in this time frame, if people are doing speculative buying, they may all of a sudden, cancel an order that they had placed speculatively. So my suggestion would be to stay close to your paper supplier and to keep communicating with them about what your needs are. I know back in my previous life, when I went through these periods of time, I was always trying to understand from my customers, what it is they were looking for. So if there was ever an opportunity in the manufacturing cycle to get that in, I could let them know and have that demand filled. So being mad and going away and being pissed off won't help, but staying in communication, will definitely help. And if you are, in the market for specialty items, you're going to have a longer, more painful experience. If you can move your demand to items that are more sort of standard items for that manufacturer, you're going to be in better shape.
Okay, so there are a lot of lessons here, takeaways. Maintain a good relationship with your supplier, but you aren't the only one in the boat here. They're in the same situation. The mill's in the situation. I'm sure there's a lot of disruption and uncertainty all the way around, as you mentioned, all the way through the whole supply chain. All we know is that there are still trees growing out there, and someday those will become paper for us if we can just kind of hang in until that happens. Well, I'm looking at the question box here. I don't see anything right now. We had a question earlier about the handouts. If the handouts are still not working right, we'll fix that. But those, if you on the call want to have a copy of the handouts and aren't having success, just let us know. We'll get it to you. Again, I don't see any questions. So with that, I want to thank all the folks who called in today, those who asked questions. And I want to especially thank Mark for providing us with the information he did and giving us some insights into what to look forward to in the future regarding our paper supply and paper prices, paper production and whatnot, because paper is, of course, the lifeblood of not only printing, but mailing as well. And it's a significant concern to everybody in the business. So thanks again. Thank you, Michelle, for being the person who's in the background doing all the work. Thanks to Mark again for giving us the information, and thanks to all of you for calling in today. We look forward to seeing you next month for our next Mailers Hub webinar. And until then, stay safe. Talk to you later. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.